Alright, class. What did all these people have in common?
Ooh, I know. They were all men.
No, I mean, yes, but that's not what I'm looking for.
I know. They're all communists.
Not really. Not all of them declared themselves as communists, but were either leaning towards communism or adopting some of its policies. Now, do any of you know what happens if you are or might possibly be a communist?
I know. The US hates you very, very much.
It's easy to think so, but there's more to that. And that's what we're here to explore.
At this point, I will make a joke about communism, but those jokes have no class. Before we engage in our research question, it is important to understand the context of the Cold War. The Cold War was a period of tension between two major superpowers that emerged as such after the end of World War II. On one side, the USSR, and on the other side, the United States of America. Although there is no agreement on the start of the Cold War, many historians would argue that it began in 1946, when British Prime Minister Winston Churchill referred to an Iron Curtain that separated the East, the USSR, and countries under its influence, and the West, that included the United States and its allies, along with their respective ideologies. The Cold War was a clash between both of these ideologies, with each nation trying to demonstrate how theirs was the better of the two. Rather than this conflict escalating to an all-out war, all of the political hostility between the USA and the USSR were portrayed by threats, spying, and other measures of short war. It was, in fact, a war that had to do more with proving superiority, and spreading their ideology to other nations was a clear demonstration of superiority. Latin America became a contested territory for these two rivals. The USSR was exerting influence on this territory to promote communism, while the United States attempted to eradicate communism and instead promote capitalism.
The Central Intelligence Agency was established on September 18th by the signing of the National Security Act of 1947 by President Harry Truman. Different U.S. departments wanted to use the newly founded agency in different ways. For example, the Department of Defense wanted to focus on military intelligence and action, while Truman himself wanted the CIA to gather and sort information deemed important to the president. In the end, the agency became a blend of both wants, prioritizing itself on gathering national security information as well as taking covert action all around the globe.
I'm going to start by exploring the events that occurred in Guatemala. But before I brief on the actual US intervention in 1954, it's important to consider the country's state and connection to the United States prior to the popular uprising in 1944. Before 1944, dictator Jorge Ubico was in power. Under his rule, the Guatemalan economy was mostly held by foreign powers, with the biggest percentage being held by the United States. Then came 1944, and the country democratically elected Arbenz as their president. Arbenz's government was veering further and further leftward toward communism, as he strengthened his legitimacy and rule, and considering the context of the Cold War, the United States did not appreciate this. Under Arbenz's rule, Guatemala expropriated resources, nationalized their land, afforded freedom to the Communist Party, encouraged strikes against foreign businesses, and limited the power of foreign corporations. There was an early attempt to overthrow Arbenz in 1952 upon the Nicaraguan president's request. Truman armed and trained anti-Arbenz groups, but the operation was ultimately unsuccessful. In 1953, President Eisenhower came into power, and the methods of intervention began to change. Eisenhower approved the first ever clandestine military action in Latin America, codenamed PV Success. The CIA established camps in Honduras and Nicaragua for the non-American opposition army. After a series of confrontations, both physical and psychological, Arbenz's government surrendered and Arbenz fled the country in 1954. PV Success was indeed a success for a short period of time. Through agency assistance, the US placed Castillo Armas in power, which consequently led to a series of misfortunes for the country. Castillo was assassinated in July 1957 without having been able to successfully bring order or prosperity to Guatemala. A revolutionary movement took place which led to a succession of military regimes, some of them of extraordinary brutality. During the period of 3 decades, the military in control killed about 200,000 Guatemalans. Additionally, this so-called success was used as a model by Allen Dulles, the head of CIA since 1953 and an influential figure in beginning the trend of covert operations, to advise President Kennedy 7 years later to pursue the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Alright, let's head to Haiti now. Daniel Feniola has been in office for 3 weeks. He claims that he's strictly anti-communist, but his actions prove otherwise. So, for obvious reasons, the US pressures him out of office, and Francois Papadoc Duvalier is elected as the president of Haiti. In 1959, the US military helps Duvalier become the dictator of Haiti. Duvalier had a different strategy in comparison to the previous dictators in Latin America to control his population. He used a blend of Haitian voodoo and his tonton Makute to keep his people suppressed. He used God as his tool. He created fear among his people by stating that anyone who went against him was going against the will of God, and thus would be cursed. The tonton was Duvalier's secret police that would terrorize people with machetes. Over 100,000 people were killed by his tonton during his reign. Duvalier was very open about his strategies towards terrorizing his people. In an interview with Alan Wicker, he stated that the military man has to obey the orders that he receives from the president, from the king, and from the emperor. It's good to know how he thinks about himself. Let's fast forward a bit. There's really nothing left to talk about Duvalier at this point. It's 1971, and Papadoc is no longer the dictator. The country is now under the rule of his son, Jean-Claude Baby Doc Duvalier. He continues his father's legacy, a reign of terror in Haiti, with full knowledge of the CIA. However, his reign soon comes to an end in 1986. Revolts in Haiti keep getting worse and worse, and it keeps getting harder for the Tonton to contain the rebels. So, the CIA flies Baby Doc to France, where he can retire in peace. And the elections in Haiti are rigged yet again in favor of a CIA right-wing military strongman.
In Cuba, Fulgencio Batista led a successful military coup, establishing himself as an authoritarian dictator. He solidified his power with the military and Cuba's economic elite and got his government recognized by the United States. His government had almost no popular support due to his corrupt and oppressive rule. Despite his unpopularity, however, the United States supported Batista's rule. Not only was he an anti-communist leader, but also under his rule, the United States was able to crank up a lot of profit. By the time Fidel Castro successfully overthrew Batista in 1959, the United States had investments in Cuba totaling $800 to $900 million, and American corporations controlled 90% of the island's electric and telephone service, 50% of the railroad system, 40% of the sugar acreage, and 25% of the banking industry. Therefore, when Castro came into power, the United States was not happy. He took immediate action to reduce American influence on the island. He nationalized the American-dominated industries, introduced land reform schemes, and called on other Latin American governments to act with more autonomy. In other words, Castro was not only rejecting American imperialism in Cuba, but he was also encouraging Latin American countries to do the same and follow his example. Castro then began, similar to Arbenz, being further and further leftward towards communism. Castro's communist stance is clearly depicted in his May Day celebration speech, in which he states, "We have understood better than ever that there are two classes of citizens, or rather there were two classes of citizens, the citizens who worked, produced, and created, and the citizens who lived without working or producing. These latter were parasites." As if this wasn't enough to provoke the United States leaders to take action, Castro's government established diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union and other communist socialist nations. Consequently, President Eisenhower orders the CIA to recruit, train, and arm Cuban exiles for an attack on Cuba. In 1961, however, President John F. Kennedy comes into power and is handed this operation. Although initially hesitant, after much convincing from CIA officers and Allen Duell's part, Kennedy allows the operation to take its course. The operation was known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. No, not this Bay of Pigs, this Bay of Pigs. In April 1961, the CIA launched what they believe will be a definitive strike to overthrow Castro's regime in Cuba. Around 1,200 to 1,400 American-trained Cuban exiles led a full-scale invasion on the country, only to surrender under 24 hours of fighting. There were several results from this short-lived confrontation. First, 114 Cuban exiles were killed and over 1,100 were captured. Second, the US aggression led to the request of Soviet aid from Castro's part, which would include missiles and the construction of missile bases, which would eventually spark the Cuban Missile Crisis. Lastly, Kennedy suffered a humiliating defeat that would create lasting tensions between the two nations.
Hello again. Did you miss me? No? Fine. Well, joke's on you, because nobody misses me anyways. Anyways, let's head to Ecuador now. US intervention in Ecuador began in 1961 when CIA-backed military forces forced the democratically elected president Jose Velasco to resign. Velasco opposed American policies of breaking relations with Cuba and suppressing communist activists in Ecuador. So Vice President Carlos Arosemena was elected as president, and his spot of vice president was taken by a puppet of the CIA. The CIA infiltrated almost every single political organization to channel young radicals away from support to Cuba and from anti-Americanism. and to coordinate activities that had CIA priority. Noted personalities would make speeches that supported CIA propaganda, and then CIA-controlled news agencies would glorify them. Documents made by the CIA would be found on people of Cuba at the airport. These documents would then be publicized and verified fears in the Ecuadorian population about communist plans of Cuba or the USSR to take over Ecuador. And soon enough, Arosemana was no longer any more acceptable to the CIA than Velasco because, well, he was reluctant to break relationships with Cuba. So, consequently, he was soon removed from office, and the 1964 elections were not rigged, but cancelled for the CIA to assign a puppet as the new president.
E agora vem um tema muito importante para mim. Vamos falar sobre a ditadura militar de 1964. No dia 31...
Speak English!
Okay. As I was saying, on March 31st, 1964, democratically elected Brazilian President João Goulart was victim of a coup supported by, you guessed it, the CIA. In the 1950s, Brazil is experiencing rapid economic and industrial growth, all the while enveloping itself in foreign trade. When Goulart took office in 1960, however, Brazil's economic policies shifted to cut out imports and nationalize many of their industries, which backfired and led to a crisis with inflation and rising international debt. Nevertheless, Goulart was adored by the Brazilian people, winning a public plebiscite by an overwhelming 4-1. But he was not well liked by the military, who labeled him as a socialist threat. This was because of his communist policies and ties to China, Cuba, and certain European communist states, which also aroused speculation from the United States, as it began secretly supplying the Brazilian armed forces with over 100 tons of supplies including weapons, ammunitions, and tear gas. With that kind of support, Brazilian generals began mobilizing their forces towards Rio to depose their president, with U.S. Ambassador to Brazil, Lincoln Gordon, relaying his beliefs that Goulart was trying to perpetuate himself in power unconstitutionally. The states quietly supported the upcoming coup. In the early hours of March 31st, the military took control of the country without opposition, as Goulart fled to Uruguay and Ranieri Mazzilli was appointed as a temporary president. However, 2 days prior to that, puzzling enough, President Johnson already sent his warmest good wishes to the soon-to-be president of this military regime, which strengthened its legitimacy in the eyes of other countries. Declassified CIA documents also reveal that their support did not end there. The Brazilian military government was known for its ruthlessness, torturing tens of thousands of communist rebels that ranged anywhere from students to members of the church. The agency evidently trained Brazil's torturers extensively and backed the junta with millions of dollars, extending the regime to span over 21 years. This shows just how far the US would go against its praised democracy to avoid countries from veering too far to the left.
Before communist leaders rose to power in Bolivia, the CIA didn't put much attention towards Bolivia. But once the US assessed that Bolivia could possibly become a communist country, the CIA started to put their attention towards the country. In 1964, the US supported the first coup in Bolivia, led by René Barrientos. In 1967, the death of Che Guevara sparked another communist rise in Bolivia. 3 years after Che's death, leftist army general Juan José Torres took the throne in Bolivia. His communist ideals made the US mad, which in turn made them decide to perform another coup. This second coup took more than one attempt to be successful, only to be useless towards another leftist far rise in 1982, led by Hernán Siles Suazo. The US decided to stop supporting anti-communist movements in Bolivia until the government took action. For the next 20 years, Bolivia had a great quantity of corrupt leaders. Today, Bolivia is the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. When Evo Morales rose to power in 2005, many US companies left Bolivia due to high taxes to foreign companies. Evo was the first indigenous leader to rise to power in Bolivia. Until today, there is still a situation of conflict between the US and Bolivia.
The Dominican Republic was in a state of civil war that started on April 28, 1965, when civilian supporters of former coup President Juan Bosch overthrew President Donald Reed Cabral. Numerous parties then began the fight for power, many having communist leaders, and fearing another Castro in power, Lyndon B. Johnson sent in over 20,000 US troops. Johnson's public explanation for the deployment was to extract the few American citizens in the country, but as General Earl Wheeler said to the commander of the US forces heading into the DR, Your unannounced mission is to prevent the Dominican Republic from going communist. The sheer amount of troops called for an immediate ceasefire between the parties, and as they reached Santo Domingo, a second and final ceasefire was signed on May 5th. US troops were tasked with keeping the peace at the capital until May 26th, when they were slowly withdrawn from the country. 1 year later, on July 1st, Joaquim Balaguer, an abusive right-wing leader, was elected president, meaning mission accomplished for the United States.
Allende won the elections in Chile democratically. He was about to start nationalizing mining companies in Chile, similar to how Castro did with foreign companies in Cuba. The US had planned a coup weeks before Allende's election in 1970, but the coup did not happen until 3 years later. Henry Kissinger, the national security advisor for the US during the Chilean coup led by Pinochet, had witnessed Pinochet's crimes during his regime. Even after seeing the atrocities that the military had committed during his regime, the US still supported Pinochet's government financially and militarily. Thousands of citizens were exiled during Pinochet's regime. Many fled the country, and even more were murdered in stadiums that were used as concentration camps. But the US was doing everything it could to prevent the spreading of communism throughout Latin America. Before the elections in 1970, the US wanted Eduardo Frei to run a presidential campaign, hoping to shut down Allende's campaign. The CIA last report was a military-backed coup d'etat. Frei lost elections, and the CIA started planning possible dates for the strike. On September 11th, the coup started with the movement of Chilean troops throughout the Chilean coast. By 9:10 a.m., via radio station, Allende had said his last words. He could hear gunshots and explosions outside the palace. He was offered a safe passage out, but he refused to accept the deal and looked like a coward. He chose to fight for the responsibility that the Chilean people had given him. After the bombing of La Moneda, Allende was found dead inside. He had committed suicide. Hours later, Pinochet had taken over the Chilean government. After the coup, Kissinger had a phone conversation with Richard Nixon, in which the latter asked if the US had direct intervention in the coup. Kissinger said that the CIA didn't directly give military power to Chile, but they did provide money, guns, and information.
The US intervention was successful in all Latin American countries that we talked about.
Except for Cuba. Go Castro!
Yes, Cuba was an exception. Actually, to this day, Cuba is still a communist country.
That's right, and although Cuba was the only country that the United States wasn't able to depose the communist leader in power, many current leaders such as Dilma in Brazil and Rafael Correa in Ecuador, as well as entire political parties, have leaned towards communist/socialist policies.
The overthrow of democratically elected governments in countries by the United States led to successions of various dictatorships and military regimes, as well as periods of hardships for the countries due to the oftentimes corrupt and oppressive rule from the government's part. In many cases, this led to the displacement, torture, and even deaths of hundreds of thousands of Latin Americans.
One positive aspect that was brought to Latin America due to US intervention was an economic boost for subjects of intervention, as seen by, for example, in Chile and Brazil. As for the US, they were able to get rid of the communist threat in various countries. Overall, the United States and the Latin American countries intervened by such faced both benefits and consequences. And although we are inclined to believe that the effects of US intervention in Latin America were mostly negative, it's always important to ask ourselves, do we really have all the information needed to simply conclude by saying that the United States' actions were not justified?
Nonetheless, from the information that we do have access to, the effects of US intervention is clear, and from that we have reached the conclusion that although the United States was able to stop the growth of communism in Latin America, the drawbacks far outweigh the benefits.